Learning Disabilities, abbreviated as LD. Subscribe, like, and share so you can receive notifications for future videos. Today, we will talk about the definition, characteristics, identification, prevalence, causes, educational considerations, and transition for learning disabilities. Starting with the definition. A learning disability is a disorder in psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, which may be manifested in problems with listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or doing mathematical calculations. Each one of those areas has its own label for that type of learning disability. Learning disabilities do not include a disorder associated with hearing, vision, motor problems, intellectual disabilities, developmental delays, or emotional behavioral disorders. So let's look at some of the characteristics. Previous labels for learning disabilities included slow learners, minimally brain injured, perceptually disabled, and dyslexic. Dyslexia is a severe disability in learning to read, particularly as it relates to decoding. Dysgraphia is a severe difficulty learning to write, including handwriting. Dyscalculia is a severe disability in learning mathematical concepts and computation. An auditory processing disorder is when there's trouble distinguishing similar sounds or confusing the sequence of heard or spoken sounds. Finally, visual perception or visual motor deficit is the inability to differentiate between foreground and background, as well as similar looking numbers, letters, shapes, objects, and symbols. Problems may include habitually skipping over lines of text. So how do we identify learning disabilities? Here are a few red flags. The child may guess constantly when reading. Perhaps they have difficulty understanding and following directions. They may speak well but read poorly. Possibly they'll have extreme difficulty with math. Perhaps they confuse similar words and letters such as B and D, P and Q, or with words that are similar such as was and saw, or on and no. Another red flag is difficulty expressing thoughts. Let's look at a few more red flags. A child may have trouble understanding time and distance, or have difficulty memorizing words or basic math. They may also have a short attention span or get easily distracted. They may have poor learning strategies. Perhaps they're overactive, inactive, or just unmotivated. And finally, maybe they confuse left, right, up, and down. Before seeking a diagnosis for a learning disability, be sure to exclude hearing or vision impairments, intellectual disabilities, developmental delays, and emotional behavioral disorders. Then you want to start looking for problems with academic and learning tasks, discrepancies between expected and actual achievement, and disorders in basic psychological processing. Let's take a brief look at a normal curve for IQ scores. The average human has an IQ score or an intelligence quotient of 100. If we move over to the right, we'll see a score of 115. This score is a high average IQ score. If we go over to the left, the score will be 85, and this score is a low average IQ score. The important thing to remember is a score between 85 and 115 is considered average. Students with learning disabilities tend to fall in the average to high average range when it comes to IQ score. In terms of the shady 80s or the lower IQ range, it's not usually likely for a student with a learning disability to be in this region. So why do an IQ test? We're looking for problems with oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading comprehension, mathematics calculation, and mathematics reasoning in order to figure out which, if any, category will qualify for a learning disability. There used to be a system where we looked at achievement and a discrepancy between IQ scores and achievement. However, this method ended up being statistically flawed, and it was very difficult and expensive to use this formula, as you had to pay diagnosticians or psychologists in order to do an IQ test. Also, IQ scores have been found to be unreliable because of reading ability. And unless the student is in a higher grade, this idea of looking at achievement versus an IQ is useless in the early grades. We also want to make sure we avoid a wait to fail method of identification, which is what this system did. We waited for the child to show difficulty for a long period of time before testing them with their ability versus their IQ score. Instead of using a wait to fail method, many schools and districts incorporated the use of response to intervention, or RTI, but there were a few precautions to make sure you considered. There's little evidence on effectiveness for the identification using RTI, and most of the research is focused only on reading. Many teachers are failing to use evidence-based instruction in Tier 1, which is in the general education classroom. Too much variability in what is happening in Tier 2 has been found, so we're not quite sure which interventions are actually working for those small groups. Most RTI models were implemented in early elementary before required skills are more complex. And finally, there may be too much recycling between Tiers 1 and 2 when students really need Tier 3 supports, which could also be considered special education. Some of the measures used for identifying learning disabilities are the Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC-3, academic assessments, observations, student work sample analysis, or interviews. So let's look at the prevalence. How often will we see learning disabilities? Approximately 5% of students aged 6 to 17 have been identified as having a learning disability, and this prevalence has more than doubled since 1977. Why has there been such an increase? Well, there's a reluctance to blame problems with teaching. We try to look away from the teaching that's happening within the classroom and focus on the student. There's social cultural changes such as poverty and stress, and also society prefers the label of a learning disability over an intellectual disability. Boys tend to outnumber girls 3 to 1 in terms of having a learning disability. Now let's look at a few possible causes. Most causes are unknown, but it's possible that there are brain cell changes. It could be hereditary and passed down from parents, biochemical imbalances in the brain, or possibly from the environment. Some prenatal causes include illness or injury during or before birth, drugs and alcohol use during pregnancy, and Rh incompatibility with the mother if left untreated. A few perinatal causes, or during birth, include premature or prolonged labor, a lack of oxygen in the baby, or low weight at birth. A few postnatal causes include head injuries, nutritional deprivation, poisonous substances such as lead, and child abuse. Few accommodations to help children with learning disabilities include allow students to demonstrate learning in multiple ways, such as visual, auditory, or tactile. Provide extra time for doing work or tests or assignments. Have a note taker and/or audio tape class sessions. Caption videos, use audio textbooks, and computer programs that provide speech to text or any type of speech output. A few teaching strategies include make instruction simple and clear. Teach students to use memory strategies. Use visual representations or mapping. Give opportunities to practice what they have learned. Teach students to keep track of how they're learning and recording their performance. Teach them how to do self-monitoring. Also give rewards, encourage, and praise. Finally, you can always scaffold instruction. A few more educational considerations. For math, you may want to use explicit teacher-led instruction with immediate error correction. For reading, we can focus on phonics instruction and repeated readings. In writing, we can look at self-regulated strategy development, and in science and social studies, we can focus on content enhancement and graphic organizers and mnemonics. Gotta leave you with a couple more educational considerations. Direct instruction is a wonderful teaching strategy, which includes task analysis, scripted, sequenced, and fast-paced lessons, drill and practice, and small groups. There's also peer tutoring, where you can incorporate class-wide peer tutoring or peer-assisted learning strategies. Transition. We want to make sure children with learning disabilities are able to transition from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school, and from high school to beyond. So we have to be sure to build up their perseverance, their ability to set goals, acceptance of weaknesses and strengths, access to a strong network of social support, extensive educational intervention, high quality vocational job training, supportive work environments, and the ability to take control of their own life. When we're working on the IEP or the Individualized Education Plan, we must include transition goals, and we want to make sure that these goals include preparation for the workforce, college, and making informed choices. So in terms of preparation for the workforce, we want to focus on basic skills, functional skills, and work study for their chosen profession. In terms of preparing for college, we want to look at continued support, consultation, and learning strategies. And as far as making informed choices, we want the student to help us write the goals for their transition plan and also get their input for the summary of performance. Thank you for watching this presentation about learning disabilities.